Remedios Garza finished covering her husband's grave with the last borrowed shovelful of earth and knew, in that very instant, that there was no longer any place left she could call her own. If you believe that true loyalty isn't bought with a last name, but with presence, subscribe to Cuentos del Viejo Campo and ring the bell. We already have another story waiting for you. That dawn in the highlands of Michoacán smelled of wet earth and smoke from old firewood. Remedios was 62 years old, her hands cracked by 4 decades of work, and a dark shawl covered shoulders that had forgotten how to stand straight. She had buried Don Porfirio without great ceremony. Not because she didn't love him, but because real pain doesn't need witnesses to be real. What she did notice, as she walked back along the dusty dirt road, was that none of her brothers-in-law had shown up. Not the eldest sister-in-law, who lived 2 leagues away. Not the youngest, who had promised her in church that he would never leave her alone. No one. The house where they had lived for 38 years did not belong to her. It had never belonged to her. It was Garza family land, and the Garza family had waited exactly 17 days after the burial to tell her so. 17 days during which Remedios cooked for no one, swept the corridor out of habit, and woke every morning staring at the empty nail where Don Porfirio used to hang his hat. It was Balbina, the shrill-voiced sister-in-law, who arrived with a man carrying rolled-up papers under his arm. They came on a Tuesday, when the sun was falling straight down onto the front corridor. Balbina walked in without greeting anyone, scanned the kitchen with her eyes as though taking inventory, and then turned around. "Here are the documents," she said, without looking at her. "The land belongs to Ernesto. It always did. You will sign and leave it free for us before the month is out." Remedios did not answer. She took the papers. She read them slowly, her mouth pressed shut, while the man in the hat stared toward the hills so he wouldn't have to see her face. There was a clause stating that the land had been the property of Porfirio's father, and that in the absence of a clear will it passed to the male children. Ernesto was the only son. 38 years counted for nothing. What Balbina did not tell her, because she herself did not know, was that Don Porfirio had tried to make a different arrangement, that he had spoken with a notary in Zitácuaro 4 years ago. But Remedios did not know that yet. In the village, the news spread the way water spreads through Scrubland. The widow Remedios is alone. They've already taken the house. She has no one. Some women shook their heads with genuine pity, others with something that looked more like the satisfaction of those who always knew it would end this way. There were those who said that a woman of her age, without children, without land of her own, had no choice but to find a relative to take her in or accept the road. Remedios chose the road. She packed what fit in an old grain sack, 2 changes of clothes, a small clay jar that had been her mother's, a mended blanket stitched with threads of different colors that she herself had sewn over the years whenever the wool unraveled, and a small dark wood rosary that hung from a nail in the bedroom. She took it down slowly, wrapped it in a handkerchief, and tucked it to the bottom of the sack. And she left, without looking back, without sliding the bolt, without saying goodbye to anything. She walked 2 hours along the dirt road until she reached the junction where the Zitácuaro bus passed. She had an address written on a crumpled piece of paper, a second cousin toward Zitácuaro, though it had been 12 years since they'd seen each other. That was all she had. The bus let her off at a crossroads she didn't recognize, because the driver said it was the last branch route of the afternoon. It was already late, the sun sinking red between the hills, and the mountain fog was beginning to descend through the cedar trees. Remedios sat on a stone at the edge of the dirt road, her grain sack between her feet and the mended blanket pressed against her chest. She thought of Porfirio, of how his freshly washed shirt smelled hanging in the sun. of how he prayed in such a low voice that you could never make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Calm, steady. She closed her eyes. Then she understood something she had already suspected, that the hardest loneliness isn't being alone, but being alone in a place where no one knows your name. What she did not yet know was that that crossroads had a name, and that that name was going to change everything she had left of her life. It was called La Vereda del Pedregal. The rocky path, and 200 steps uphill, stood an old farmhouse with adobe walls and a step-tile roof, a front corridor that looked out toward the mountain, and an apple orchard in the back. The farmhouse smelled of burning firewood even on days when the cold hadn't arrived, because inside there was always a fire going, and inside there was always someone who needed warmth even if they didn't know how to ask for it. Tadeo Morellis was 47 years old, had 2 children, and had built his patience through hard, repeated loss. His wife had died of fever when the eldest, Calixto, was 6 years old, and the little girl, Lucinda, had barely learned to walk. Since then, Tadeo had raised them both as best he could, rising before dawn to have the clay pot coffee ready, mending sandals by firelight, learning to braid Lucinda's hair from watching her try to do it herself in front of a piece of mirror. He was a man of few words, with hands calloused from working wood and rope, and a quiet gaze. If God had given him that burden, God had also given him the back to carry it. That afternoon, Tadeo was coming down from checking the pen when he saw the woman sitting on the stone at the edge of the road. "Ma'am," he called from the gate. "Night is coming on." Remedios looked up. She said nothing. "Do you have somewhere to go?" "I'm headed to Zicuaro." "But the bus doesn't run anymore today." Tadeo looked at the sky turning red. He looked at the grain sack. He looked at the mended blanket she was pressing against herself, without realizing it. "Then, come inside. There are beans on the stove and a room we don't use." He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask where she'd come from, or why she was alone at a crossroads after dark. He just opened the gate and waited. Something inside her, something that had been clenched for weeks like the knot of an old rope, sat down for the first time in a long while. That night, Remedios slept on a cot beside the window that looked out onto the orchard. The night damp crept through the gaps in the old wood, but the mended blanket was thick. Outside, the agave plants were quiet shadows against the night sky of Michoacán, and the owls called from some cypress tree she couldn't see. God willing, she thought before closing her eyes. God willing, tomorrow I will understand where I am. The next morning, she rose before dawn. Her whole life had been like that. First to wake, last to sleep. She found the kitchen empty and the fire out. She lit the firewood without making noise and set the water for clay pot coffee. When Tadeo came down the wooden stairs at 6 in the morning, he found the scent of coffee filling the front corridor as though it had always been that way. He stopped on the last step. "You didn't have to trouble yourself," he said. "It's no trouble," she answered without turning around. "It's habit." Calixto, the eldest, was 12 years old and had the quiet distrust of children who learn early that people who arrive also leave. He sat at the far end of the table and watched her eat without saying a word. Lucinda, at 8, was more direct. "Are you somebody's grandmother?" Remedios set her clay cup on the table. "No, I never had children." Lucinda thought for a moment. "Then you don't know how to be a grandmother." "Nobody knows," said Remedios. "Until they are one." The girl nodded as if that were the most reasonable answer she had ever heard, and went back to eating her bread without any more questions. On the third day, without anyone asking her to, Remedios cleaned the front corridor. On the fourth, she mended a pillowcase that had torn at the edge. On the 5th, when Lucinda came home from school with her hair in a knot she couldn't undo, and eyes that were damp from trying not to cry, Remedios sat her down in front of her on the bench in the corridor and worked it loose with her fingers, slowly, starting from the tips. "The morning damp tangles it first," she said as she worked. "Then you have to comb it back from the root. Gently, see? Like this." The girl didn't move. She closed her eyes. "My mama used to do it that way," Lucinda said, very quietly. Remedios didn't answer. She kept combing. There were things better answered with hands than with words. That same week, Taddeo placed the mended blanket on the kitchen table. He had found it in the room and washed it at the courtyard basin without saying a word to anyone. It was spread out in the sun to dry. "It's yours," he said. "I know. It has a lot of patches. Each one has its story." He looked at her for a moment. "How long are you planning to stay, ma'am?" She folded her hands on the table. It was the question she had known was coming. "Signor Mireles, I didn't come to stay. I came to spend the night. That's been 12 nights now." "Yes," he said nothing more. He got up, took his hat from the nail, and went out to the pen. That afternoon he came back with a basket of fresh-laid eggs that he left in the pantry without saying what they were for or for whom. As if the answer had already been given, and all that was left was for someone to accept it. That night, Remedios found her wooden rosary in the room, hanging from a new bright nail that Taddeo had put in the wall beside the window. It hadn't been there before. She had never asked for it. Something in her chest stopped hurting. 3 weeks passed. Then a month. The rhythm of the farmhouse settled around Remedios the way water settles around a stone, without effort, without resistance, because it was the natural shape of things when things are in the place where they belong. Every morning, Remedios lit the fire before dawn. She put on the clay pot coffee. When Calixto came downstairs with the rope on his school bag badly knotted, she fixed it without comment. When Lucinda came out with her braid half done, she finished it on the corridor bench. Not because anyone had asked her to, but because it was what she knew how to do, and because this house had a hunger for exactly that. A kind of quiet, daily presence that no pot of beans, no matter how good, could satisfy. Calixto took longer. One Tuesday in October, he came in from the cornfield with a broken rope and set it on the table in front of her without a word. She picked it up and tied it back with the life knot that Don Porfirio had taught her 30 years ago. The one that holds no matter how hard you pull. When she handed it back, the boy tested it with his fingers, serious, tugging at both ends. Then he nodded once. That was all. But it was enough. The village kept talking. One woman told another that the widow Garza had moved into the widower Morales' farmhouse. The other told 3 more. By the 2nd week of October, the gossip had 2 versions, and neither one was true. One morning, Doa Esperanza, the most talkative woman at the Pascuaro market, appeared with an excuse about cooking oil and the sharp eyes of someone who has come to confirm something she has already decided to believe. "They say you're here as the housekeeper," she said. "People say many things," Remedios answered. "And what do you say?" "I say the coffee is already cold, and that Doa Esperanza has better things to do at home." Doa Esperanza left without her oil and without her confirmation. But the gossip continued, the way things always continue that people need to believe. One afternoon in late October, while Remedios was folding the mended blanket to put it away in the chest after letting it air in the sun, she found that under the mattress of the cot there was a loose board. She lifted it almost by reflex. The reflex of a woman who has lived in old houses and knows that old houses keep things without being asked. And there, wrapped in a carefully folded square of manta cloth, She found a thick paper envelope with the name Porfirio Garza written by hand, in ink so old it had turned the color of coffee. The name of her dead husband. But that night, Remedios was going to read something that had been waiting for her for 4 years, kept in the only place a good man knew she would find it when the time came. She opened the envelope with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from something older and deeper than fear. Inside was a letter written in Porfirio's neat, pressed handwriting, dated 4 years earlier, and beneath it, folded in thirds, a document with a notarial seal. It was a notarized title deed. The farmhouse of La Vereda del Pedregal, with all its boundaries described, its apple orchard, its adobe pen, its step-tile roof, was registered in the name of Remedios Orozco de Garza, with the signature of the notary in Zicuaro and the stamp of the Pscuaro property registry. Porfirio had done it 4 years ago, without telling her, because he knew his family better than anyone and knew exactly what was coming when he was gone. He had paid the notary with his savings. He had signed the transfer. And he had hidden the document in the only place he could think of, under the cot mattress in the guest room of a farmhouse belonging to a man he had never met, at a crossroads called La Vereda del Pedregal. Because life has a way of fulfilling what love leaves unfinished, even if it takes years and the road seems impossible. A second witness confirmed the document the following day. Don Lirigario, the church sacristan who had been present at the signing 4 years earlier. When Remedios showed him the open envelope on the table, he recognized the notary's name immediately. He knew the exact date. He said that yes, he had been there, that Porfirio had asked him to say nothing until the situation required it, and that he had promised to do exactly that. The letter said, in the firm, plain handwriting of a man who didn't know how to write beautifully, but knew how to write truly, "If you have made it here, Remedio, it is because God brought you. And if God brought you, it is because this place belongs to you." I did not know how to explain myself while I was alive. I was afraid that keeping it would seem like a farewell. But I kept it because I knew you. Because I knew you would need it. A woman like you deserves a place that is hers, without having to ask anyone's permission. Take care of yourself. And forgive me for taking so long. Remedios read the letter twice. She folded it carefully. She put it alongside the rosary in her mother's clay jar at the bottom of the grain sack, the same things she had brought when she arrived. Now she had something more. The next day she showed the papers to Tadeo. He read them in silence, sitting at the kitchen table, the clay pot coffee steaming between them. When he finished, he laid the papers on the wood carefully and said nothing for a moment that felt longer than it was. "So, this is your farmhouse," he said at last. "That's what the document says. And what are you going to do?" Remedios looked at the front corridor, the orchard, the rosary, on the new nail by the window. "For now," she said, "the coffee is already on." Balbina did not come alone. She came with Ernesto, the brother-in-law, and with a man from the city who carried a leather briefcase and the expression of someone who believes that problems are resolved by firm presence and papers of one's own. It was a Tuesday in early November, with a north wind coming down through the ravine. Remedios was in the front corridor mending the sleeve of Calixto's shirt when she saw them coming up the dirt road. Tadeo was in the pen and came over without anyone calling him, because there are things a man notices even when no one tells him to look. Balbina spoke first, from the gate, without greeting anyone. "We were told you have papers. We've come to see them." Remedios set the sewing on the bench. She didn't move. "Good morning," she said. "Those papers are forgeries," said Ernesto, his voice tight with the strain of someone saying something he isn't sure he can prove. Porfirio had no authority to dispose of this property without the family's consent. "This property," said Remedios, her back straight and her voice steady, not rising even a note, "did not belong to the family. It belonged to Porfirio, and Porfirio registered it in my name before a notary, with witnesses, 4 years ago." The man with the briefcase took a step forward. "Ma'am, if you want to avoid a costly legal process," Tadeo stepped out of the corridor and stood beside Remedios, hands in his pockets and the calm gaze of a man in no hurry. He said nothing. He simply stood there. And that was enough. Blood families sometimes fall apart when there's a weight to carry. But loyalty stays. And in the end, loyalty is the only thing that matters. Balbina opened her mouth. She closed it. The man with the briefcase exchanged a look with Ernesto. Remedios drew the document from the grain sack and held it out in front of them without letting go, so they could see it without touching it. "The notary in Siquaro has a copy on file. The property registry in Hesquaro as well. Don Leodegario witnessed the signing and can confirm it." A cold, final silence passed between them all. "Porfirio made a mistake," Balbina said at last, in a voice that had lost its arrogance and held only the hard bone of pride that doesn't know how to surrender. "You have no one here. You have no family. You have no roots in this land." Remedios looked her in the eyes. "Roots aren't inherited, Balbina. They're grown." A pause. "Now I thank you to leave my front corridor." The three of them walked back down the dirt road without another word, without taking anything, without anyone chasing them off with shouts. They were defeated in the only way people who act with injustice deserve to lose, in silence, in front of everyone, with no face left to show. From the chapel, Don Leodegario watched them pass and looked down. By afternoon, the village had a new version of the story. The one about a woman who didn't shout or cry, who waited for the truth to come on its own, because truth always comes, even when it takes a long time and the road seems impossible. The afternoon settled into quiet. A dove landed on the edge of the pen. Tadeo took his hands out of his pockets. "Are you all right?" Remedios swallowed slowly. Then she nodded. "Yes," she said. "I'm all right now." When spring came that year, the farmhouse at La Vereda del Pedregal smelled of fresh baked bread before dawn, and that smell drifted through the cypress trees and down the dirt road like a warm signal that there was life here, that a table was set here, that someone had stayed. Remedios had discovered that Lucinda had a gift for dough. The natural instinct of people who are born knowing how much salt is enough without measuring it. Calixto, when no one was watching him directly, liked to stay in the kitchen and watch the bread puff up on the clay griddle. The front corridor had geraniums in clay pots that Lucinda had transplanted from the orchard in December, and the mended blanket hung over the railing on Saturdays so the morning sun could warm it through. The wooden rosary was still on its nail by the window. Remedios's mother's clay jar had its place on the kitchen shelf, as though it had always been there. Don Arsenio, the neighbor from the plot below, brought warm milk on Wednesdays because he had more than he needed, and it was better to give it to someone. Señora Consuelo from the chapel brought a basket of peaches once, and stayed for coffee without anyone inviting her, and then kept coming back every 2 weeks because Remedios's clay pot coffee was, in her words, the best on the entire stretch of road. One April afternoon, Tadeo came back from the market with more flour than he'd planned, and a folded paper in his coat pocket. He put the flour in the pantry and left the paper on the table. "It's from the notary. The brothers-in-law aren't going to file anything." The man with the briefcase told them they have no case. Remedios didn't look up from the beans she was sorting. "I knew they wouldn't." "How did you know?" because Porfirio's papers were properly done. A man who does something in secret to protect you does it right, or he doesn't do it at all. Taddeo sat down on the other side of the table. He looked at her for a long moment. "Signora Remedios," he said, "my children never had a grandmother." She set the beans on the table and looked up. "I never had children," she said. "I know that already." A silence passed between them, not uncomfortable, but the kind that fills the space of things that don't need to be said because they have already been said in other ways. In nails put into walls, in braids finished on the corridor bench, in ropes reknotted without anyone asking. "You are alone," said Teddo, "and this is your farmhouse. But it's a big farmhouse for one person, and you have 2 children and a farmhouse 200 steps away." Exactly. Remedios went back to the beans. She sorted them slowly. Then, without raising her voice, she said, "Sunday bread. We'll bake it in my oven. It fits more." That afternoon, when Calixto and Lucinda came home from school with their bags full of field dirt and the hunger of children who have walked 2 leagues on foot, they found the table set for 5. Remedios, Taddeo, the 2 of them, and Don Arsenio, who had come with his milk and stayed because Lucinda had told him there was a nice bread and because he couldn't remember the last time he had eaten at a table with that kind of noise. The noise of children arguing over who gets the biggest piece of bread. The noise of someone refilling coffee without asking if you want more. The noise of the mended blanket rippling from the corridor railing while the April sun comes in sideways through the adobe pillars and paints everything it touches gold. The clay jar on the shelf. The rosary on its nail. The hands of a woman who didn't know how to be a grandmother, but is being one anyway. Because no one knows how until they are. Sometimes God places exactly the right people at exactly the right crossroads, not because we have asked for it, but because He knows better than we do what we are missing and what we have to give. Sometimes home is not the place where you were born. It is the place where someone opened the gate without asking your name, and where you lit the fire without anyone asking you to, and that, with time, becomes home. It becomes roots. Was there ever a person you least expected who turned out to be the one who needed you most? If this story touched something in your heart, leave us a comment and tell us what part of Mexico you're watching from, or where you're watching from in the world. Subscribe to the Cuentos del Viejo Campo channel and ring the bell so you don't miss a single story. Share this with someone who needs to know it is never too late to put down roots. Until the next story. Lucinda, that night, before Remedios put out the kitchen fire, came close and said to her in a very low voice, "Now I know what it is to have a grandmother. It's you."